Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Welcome to today's Capture One webinar with a very special guest, Michael, who we'll say hello to in a second. So today is all about working in Capture One on portrait/beauty images using all the various tools that we have to make them great. So as I just mentioned, with me, Michael, if you're there. Yes, you are. Great.
I'm here, David.
Fantastic. So if you don't know who you're listening to, I'm the guy at the top. That's David, part of the software sales team for Phase 1, based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And then Michael, I'm going to attempt to get it right, Woloszynowicz. Pretty close,
Pretty
I hope.
close. Pretty close.
Who is a photographer, owner of Vibrant Shots, and you're currently for an extended period in Los Angeles, correct?
I am, yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic, fantastic. Slightly warmer than Toronto at the moment.
Definitely.
Yeah. As usual, we've got 60 minutes with Michael. You're very welcome to ask questions. Michael won't see the questions; they just come straight through to me, and then I'll feed in the most popular ones get Michael to answer those probably nearer to the end of the session so that we don't break up the flow, etc. There is quite a lot of you, so if we don't get to your specific question, please don't be offended. It's just really a matter of time and trying to get the most common questions in. I am recording it too, so if you can't stay for the whole thing, or you would ideally like to watch this all over again, then you can pick it up on the YouTube channel probably sometime tomorrow. So that's enough chatter from me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to switch over screen to Michael, which will just take me 1 second. So let's make Michael the presenter. So you should see a pop-up in a second, Michael.
Yep, I should be seeing my screen shortly.
Yep, we can see your screen nice and clearly for sure. So,
all right, perfect.
Explain what you're going to do, and then we can get started.
All right, so basically we're going to look at kind of touching on a good number of the features inside of Capture One to kind of do a start-to-finish retouch on, a portrait or kind of test look or something like that. Obviously, we're not attempting to replace Photoshop entirely. This is more of a workflow that you would use in cases where you don't need to have, an absolutely perfect retouch. You just need something that looks good and you can deliver to the client. Obviously, there's situations like, for example, a fashion test shoot where you can't really justify spending 2 hours per image or something along those lines inside of Photoshop, and it's nice to do it inside of Capture One, especially when you have very basic retouching that you need to do, particularly if it's black and white, then all the easier. And you kind of get the benefit of having the flexibility of staying inside the raw file, whereas obviously once you pass it off to Photoshop, then you sort of flattened out that information and you're stuck with what you got there. And the other benefit of doing it in here, of course, is there's less overhead in terms of the image itself. So, whereas like a 50 megapixel phase 1 shot could be, at minimum probably 300 megabytes inside of Photoshop if you're doing 8-bit, and obviously, 500 plus if you're doing 16-bit. Inside here, all the dodging and burning that I've done here, the kind of annotation file that goes along with this is like 25 megabytes. So certainly much smaller, less overhead, and more flexibility. So that's kind of what you gain. And as you'll see, something like dodging and burning, for example, is not quite as simple. But again, this is not kind of intended to replace Photoshop. It's more like if you have a simple situation where you just need to dodge and burn a few little things just to punch up the image, it works really well for that. So basically we're going to be starting off with this image, and then we're going to end off somewhere around here. So we're going to do some dodging and burning, some color grading, and look at the various tools that we have available to us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on that. Chose this image just because it gives us a lot of color grading options, and it makes it feel like it's nice and warm outside. So if you're somewhere cold, this will hopefully warm you up just a little bit. So we're going to go ahead, and generally where I tend to start is on the dodging and burning side. The reason for that is You don't want to have too many other adjustments going at the same time because you want the response time of those masking changes that you're making to show up as quickly as possible. That has been greatly improved. We did kind of a similar webinar, I think, David, was it a year ago or 2 years ago? I can't even remember at this point.
I think it was 2 years ago. It might
2 years ago.
shudder
Yeah, so
to think it might even have been longer than that, to be honest.
I think we were at around version 7 at best, I think, around that time, maybe.
I think so, yeah.
Since then, there's been a lot of things that have been kind of improved to help with the dodging and burning, one of which is that response time. The second is the number of layers that you can actually have, so these local adjustments, essentially. And the last one is that we have flow and opacity now, so we don't just have the opacity, which we had before. And for me, when I'm dodging and burning, I much prefer the flow over the opacity, and I'll show you why that is in a minute. So first thing we're going to start with, I'm not going to create all of these layers manually. I'll show you a shortcut for doing that, because essentially we have to create sort of 5 layers to really get started with our dodging and burning. So I'll create one of them, and then I'll show you how you can kind of grab them from a different image. So we're going to create our layer here, just clicking the plus sign. Just make sure that your layer is an adjustment layer, and I'll show you where that shows up. But if we're going to do something like dodge, correct, so we're going to have a couple of different kinds. We're going to have like the correct layers, the dodge and burn correcting layers, and then we're going to have contouring layers. And shameless plug, I do have a course on dodging and burning, so you can check out my website. You can find it in there where I kind of go into more detail about this stuff. But basically, correction is where we're trying to fix, little imperfections in the skin, and the contouring is where we're adding a little bit more of that kind of 3-dimensional effect by selectively dodging and burning certain areas, just to give a little bit more localized contrast. So with the dodging and burning correct, generally what I recommend is going around like minus 0.4, sorry, actually plus 0.4, because since we're dodging. So, nope, not that, 0.4, there we go. So with dodging, obviously we're lightening, and with burning, we're darkening. So with the burn, we would go minus 0.4. When I'm doing the contouring layers, I'll show you, I generally go about half a stop in exposure. And you can vary this up. Anywhere from 0.35 to 0.5 is kind of the range that I recommend. Anything beyond that is a little bit extreme, and you don't really need to go that far. And then in combination with the flow rate that I'll show you, it tends to work fairly well. It gives you a nice steady buildup. So that's really all we need in order to create a dodge. And obviously, the burn layer is the same thing. We're just going to call it burn correct, and we're going to go minus 0.4. So I'm going to copy some of those over. But what I'll show you first is kind of the difference between the flow and the opacity. So if you hit the B key, you grab the brush, and then if you hit M, it will show you what the mask is. So if we start kind of brushing in here, you'll start seeing kind of the areas that we're painting. So right now we are set to 100% opacity and 50% flow. But let's do this. Let's go to 100% flow and then like something like 8% opacity. So if I start to brush here, you'll notice that no matter how much I go over it, it kind of stays the same, right? So I can keep going over, and I mean, it won't build up until I lift my pen off of my tablet. And as a side note, I do recommend using like a Wacom tablet or something for this, because using a mouse or a touchpad is not the best thing for dodging and burning. So this was kind of what we had before, and it's not ideal because you kind of have to keep lifting your pen off the tablet in order to build up that effect, which we don't want. With flow, we can kind of build it up by continuously brushing over a certain area. So if we go down to around 5 flow and then 100% opacity, if we start kind of brushing here, you'll see that I'm not lifting my pen. I'm just kind of going over and over again, and it's building up until a point where it gets to 100% essentially in that particular area. So that is what we're going to use, anywhere in the 4 to 5% on the flow rate, and I tend to keep opacity at 100. You can play with those numbers a little bit if you want. Hardness, just make sure you have it set to 0. That just gives you kind of a feather around the edge, so your edge isn't too hard. So we're going to go ahead and delete this, and I'm just going to grab my stack from another image. So here I have this sort of donor image that I'm going to use, and generally what I recommend is if you're going to have a shoot where you've got a ton of images that you're going to work on dodging and burning, just create this stack in maybe the first one, or you can open another session that you may have, and essentially all of these layers are empty, with the exception of the helper layer, which I'll tell you about. And then you can just kind of grab them and dump them into your other image. So what we can do for that is just say copy and apply adjustments, and then just if you have anything else, you can kind of take those bits off. We don't want any white balance or anything like that. Don't want any cropping. And obviously, if this is the only thing that you've done in that donor image, you don't have to do this. All of this will be unchecked. But in this case, all we want is our local adjustments. So we're going to hit copy, and then go into here, and then we're just going to click there to copy that into our image. Okay, so that's how we're going to kind of grab that stack. And again, you can do this by having just a basic session that you use as like a utility session, and in there you can have an image that you're going to continuously use as a donor image, or you can set it up once in, let's say, your first image on a series and then just copy it across. So what the helper layer is really doing for us is it's just kind of converting things to black and white so that we can see some of those areas we want to dodge a little bit better. So what you do have to do with that one is when you create it, make sure you go to here and say fill mask, because we want that one filled in. By default, masks are not filled. So you'll have to fill it first. And then basically what that's just doing is I take saturation off. I take the exposure down a little bit so that, it kind of gives me a little bit more about a contrasty effect so I can see that stuff. And then sometimes I'll push clarity up just a little bit, because that, again, helps to enhance some of those little areas we want to work on. And if you feel that you need more contrast, you can also go into the curve and just add a slight S-curve in there, just bringing down the shadows and bringing up highlights. So, kind of whatever helps you to see it, that's all you really need to do in that layer. And I just kind of like to keep it as a layer because it makes it easy to toggle it on and off whenever I need to. So go ahead and start with dodging here. So what we're going to do is just grab a small brush to start with. And again, we're not going to try and make things perfect here. It's really just a quick and dirty sort of retouch. So what I tend to do is once I make a couple of strokes, I just hit the M key just to see the mask, just to make sure that the size and everything is kind of what I want. And in this case it is. So I'm going to get rid of maybe this little suntan spot that we have on the nose here. So that's really just, a couple of swipes and it's gone. And then just any areas that you feel are kind of too dark, we can go over those areas just to kind of help them blend. And every now and then, again, let's just hit the mask key to make sure that we're not kind of painting all over the place or going too far with things. Let's just step back a little bit on this one. I think I painted too much. So, I'm not going to probably make this 100% perfect like I have in the sort of completed version here, just because I want to make sure that we get through all of the things we need, but we'll go through a little bit of it. And at this point, actually, David, it's a good time if there's any questions. You can pass them off to me, and then that way I can answer them while I'm kind of painting away here.
Noodling around, yep. Just actually a question on power. Laptop power as such. Alex was asking, do you need a supercomputer to work, etc.? Because your laptop is from what, 2013, is it?
Yeah, it's the 2013 MacBook Pro, so it's by no means anything, state of the art by today's standards, and it works. These are 50 megapixel phase 1 files, so it's they're large files. And it works fine. Obviously, if you get to the point where you've got a very complex mask, then it starts to get a little bit slower. But yes, by that point, if you have very complex masks, you probably should be doing it in Photoshop. This is really more just, you've got a couple areas that you want to tidy up. This is the way to do it. So,
yeah. And I think out of all the Capture One versions, if we go 7, 8, 9, 10, probably version 7 was the most power hungry. And then as the applications have improved, then performance has got better regardless of the system that you're working on. So if your sort of performance issues have been from older versions of Capture One, then I'd say try version 10, because you'll probably find it works faster anyway. Yeah,
it's definitely improved over time. And again, if you just kind of keep the number of other adjustments going on at the same time to a minimum, don't that's why, again, I recommend doing this as sort of the first step. That always helps to improve the response time as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you're working on what, 50 megapixel file there as well, by the looks of it?
Yeah, this one is. Yeah,
Yeah.
and crop down
So,
just a little bit so that we.
so it's by no means a 10 megapixel shot or something like that. So
No, exactly. So you can, kind of dodge in some of these shadow areas in the eye here. And I'm kind of getting there on the dodge in the face. I'm not going to go super detailed. We'll just zoom out a little bit and work on the body as well.
and you're using a relatively small brush, I guess, by the looks of it as well.
Yeah, and just
Yeah.
kind of keep checking to see what the size is. I mean, larger brushes, you tend to just use them when you're doing the contouring because those tend to be more broad areas. But for the correction, obviously, just kind of pick a brush size that is appropriate for the size of the area that you're dealing with.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm just looking through the list. So you mentioned Wacom briefly. So Joe was asking what pen are you using. So I guess what Wacom are you using is the better question to that.
Yeah, I'm just on the Intuos Pro.
Yep.
Medium. But actually, well, right now I'm on the small because when I travel, I tend to use the small. So really, any of them will do just fine. I've always used the Intuos ones, and they work just fine. So certainly, if you have a Cintiq or something like that, it's not going to hurt you, but no need to do that. The smalls are nice and cheap, and they work just fine. So,
Yeah.
and personally, actually, I prefer the small over the large. So.
Yeah, same here. I think you don't need to buy a massive A3 size tablet for photography. I don't think. In actual fact, I find I get more fatigue on a bigger tablet because you're making bigger hand gestures as such. So just a small, cheap tablet does the job.
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be anything enormous. And I was just going to add, if you're a Total Capture One novice and you're new to local adjustments and you need sort of the basic instruction, I'm just pasting a link to a YouTube channel which is like an intro to local adjustments. So that would be something which you can watch and then review again with Michael's recording as well. Yeah,
Perfect. Yeah, so just kind of taking care of some of these spots on the arm here. And again, you can decide how detailed you want to be with this. I mean, I tend to be a little bit picky with sort of minor details like this, but if this was like a test shot or something like that for a model, you don't have to go too crazy. Same thing, with a typical portrait. It's really just get the most noticeable stuff. I always tell people that with dodging and burning, it's very much follows an 80-20 kind of rule where you get 80% of the benefit in 20% of the time, and then the rest is really just kind of fine-tuning. So, the stuff that you tend to notice most immediately with your eye, especially as a photographer, as a retoucher, that's probably the most important stuff. Other people tend not to even notice that, so don't spend too much time on it. Yeah. Obviously, if it's a beauty shot or something like that, a campaign shot, then certainly take your time and do it right. But obviously, make the amount of work proportional to how much you're getting paid for the image and what the image is used for.
Exactly. And a couple of people asking about the copy paste. So just to clear that up, what you did, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but rather than having to set up all these layers for every single image, you basically had your donor image, which you then copy paste those layers in, which have the exposure adjustments. They don't have any mask drawing on, but it's just the setup of the layers, the naming, and your exposure adjustments that you had, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you can set that image up anywhere. Like I said, it could be in the same session or a different session.
Exactly.
It's really just a matter of saving you some retyping time and adjustments time and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. And a couple of people said, can we see a before and after once you're done? And then
yes,
because it's such a gradual build-up when you're brushing away.
Yeah. And right now I'm just burning a few spots. So as you can see, I'm on the burn correct layer now. I'm just working on a few little areas here, but I mean that's getting pretty close to where I probably want to be, especially time-wise. This will give us plenty of time so we can move on to the actual contouring part and then some of the color grading. So if we can kind of toggle this a few different ways. So we can individually kind of toggle that dodge. You can see what that is doing there.
Okay.
And
Yep.
generally, dodge tends to be like 80 to 90% of the work you're probably going to be dodging, and then burning is just kind of filling in the areas that you feel are just a little bit too light in comparison. And so like burn is really subtle. I just did a couple of little spots up here for now, but certainly I could do a few more. But you can see that the dodging is really kind of the area where we did most of the corrections. When you
Yeah,
have
quite a
everything.
dramatic difference. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that really only took us maybe 9 minutes or so. So it wasn't
Yeah.
really, an overly long exercise. And for a typical like model portrait or even, a portrait of anybody, I think that's pretty good. You don't need to go crazy. Now,
And
one thing you
just,
can do.
sorry,
Yeah,
Michael, just
go ahead,
to
David.
interrupt you, and just to clarify for the helper layer, which is a great idea, actually, hadn't thought of that before. So basically, that's just a layer which desaturates everything, which you turn on temporarily just to help
Right.
you visualize the darker areas and the lighter areas.
And
Yeah,
notice that it is filled in. So
yeah. So
when you
it's just
create it, just make sure you go in here and say fill mask. That will fill the whole layer in. Otherwise,
yeah.
you'll be adjusting it and you'll be wondering why nothing's happening. It's because it's not filled.
That's it. And then
So
desaturate on the exposure tool, and then you've got kind of this great way to
yeah,
visualize the image better. Yeah.
yeah. So
And when you
desaturate and then
export, of course, you're going to turn that off so it's not part of the image.
exactly. It's just a temporary thing. You can, once you're done your dodging and burning, you can delete it as well. You don't have to keep it in there.
Yeah.
The other thing we can do once we have all of these kind of done and we want to see the full effect, typically what I do is hold down the Option or Alt key and I click this while I'm holding it. That will kind of roll back all of those adjustments. Now, the one thing it will do is it will take off our helper layer as well. If you want to see that, you can also just kind of globally desaturate if you want, or if you want to see kind of a color before and after, you can, hold that down that way. So that will kind of give you a better before and after of everything that's happening. You don't have to go layer by layer. So let's go to the dodge contour. So for the contouring, we're just going to kind of punch up some of the highlight areas here and just make the image pop a little bit more. So we're going to grab a nice small brush and grab a few areas here. So let's just turn our mask on. Let's see, that's probably a little smaller than I want. So let's undo that. Still a little too small. So I'm using the square bracket keys right now to increase the size. You can right click as well and adjust the size here, but generally I find the square bracket keys tend to do just fine. In this case, actually, let's just manually go up to around probably double the size of what we had. Still a little bit more.
It's always trial and error.
Yeah, a little bit. So there we go. That's kind of what I want, so I can get rid of the mask now. And so just kind of the areas that have some existing highlights, I'm just going to kind of enhance those, maybe around the eyes here.
So this will be brightening those areas slightly, correct?
Yeah, just to kind of create even more contrast. Now I'm quite large on my brush size, just it's still too much, and you have to kind of experiment a little bit. You don't want to overdo it as well. Now notice that these ones are half a stop in exposure increase. If you want a more gradual buildup, you can take that down to something like 0.3 or whatever kind of works for you. That number is not kind of set in stone. You don't have to use those numbers. And that's probably it at that zoom level. For somebody with blonde hair, I also find it kind of works nicely if you brush in some of the hair highlights here. So you can just do that as well.
Harwell was asking, you're not necessarily zooming in at 100%. What's the reason for that?
Well, the reason is the only time I tend to zoom in at 100% is when you're working on a beauty shot and you need it to be really detailed. If you need it to be that detailed, you probably should be inside of Photoshop anyways. Imagine that you're really seeing the image, somebody's seeing it like this, which is basically like 15% maybe of the zoom, right? So there's no point in zooming in at 100% for things that people will probably never see. I mean, certainly if you're going to be blowing this up in a gallery or whatever, then worry about those little details. But again, we're kind of trying to be proportional in the amount of effort to what kind of image it is. And so, like I said, beauty shots are really the only time I ever go in at 100% because there are just details that are not really noticeable, and so there's just no point in spending time with them. So that's we've done some of the hair and kind of little highlights on the face there. And then we'll just kind of maybe do some areas of the arm here. Like some of this could have been dodged and burned just to kind of even out this highlight. Again, kind of depends on how anal you want to be with that, but we're going to keep it nice and simple today. And then we're just going to grab some, do some burning around the edges here. So we'll want a fairly large brush size, and we just want to kind of go over the shadow areas and just burn over them a bit. You know, again, just err on the side of conservatism here and don't go crazy, because then things just start to look a little unrealistic. So if you feel like you need to do more, you probably don't. It's because you've been looking at it for so long. So it's a good idea to step back and just kind of do a before and after toggle, is to make sure that it's not overdone. And then,
so the burn layer was just enhancing the shadow areas or darkening the shadow areas a little to bring out that. And just can you bring up your brush settings just so?
Brush settings I've kind of kept it the same, so it's still 100% opacity, 5% flow.
And really nice low flow, yes.
And if you found that you've gone too far on this whole thing, that maybe the contouring is too strong, like this is kind of what we've got, fairly. Oh, there we go. There's the burn. Fairly subtle still, but if you find it's too much, you can always turn the exposure down. So if if kind of globally you see that it's too heavy, you can certainly step down on that until you feel it's comfortable, or vice versa. If you feel that's not enough, you can obviously decrease the exposure on the burn or increase the exposure on the contour, or on the dodge, sorry. So there's that, and I think that's probably good enough as far as that goes. What I'm going to do is actually going to turn this off, and we're going to desaturate globally here for a second so you can see this effect on everything that we've done here. So holding on Option or Alt again, if I toggle this, it will kind of roll everything back, and you can see that's
before.
So that is where we're at. And again, depending on the image, I may spend a couple more minutes on this, but generally speaking, I think that is kind of good enough for something like a test shot or a portrait. Let's just zero this out. All right, so that took us about 15 minutes with a little bit of chatting. So it's not an overly lengthy process. And again, if you're planning on spending 45 minutes on it, that's probably an image you should be working on in Photoshop. But for quick fixes, this works really nicely. We're still in the raw file, and we can kind of do whatever we want with it going forward. So that's the one big benefit there.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's it for our dodging and burning. And I think now we'll move on to some of the other elements in terms of color grading and whatever else. So before we do that, actually, let's start with another local adjustment, which is going to be for this sky here, because we want to get this sky a little bit more of a kind of fun color. Right now it's a little bit muted and drab, so let's make it a little more interesting. We'll just create a new local adjustment, call it sky, and then we're going to go into the color editor here. And for that, we're just going to grab, in the Advanced tab, we're going to grab a blue tone, so somewhere in and around here. That will just pick a blue color for us. What we can do here is view selected color range, and you'll see what it's really selecting out, which is anything that's gray is not being selected, and the actual color being selected is shown. Because it's blue and none of the skin tones are blue or hair is blue, we can actually stretch this out a little bit just to kind of, be on the safe side that we're catching everything. As you can see, you're still not really affecting the skin tone in any way, so that's good. And then from here, we're going to just adjust some of the hue and saturation here. So the first thing I'm going to do is just smooth this out so it transitions a little bit better. And I think we're still good there. Let's make sure that's turned on. There we go. Yep, that's still good. So then with hue, I'm going to probably take it down this way. If I go this way, it's going to be more of a sort of a magenta tone, and then in this direction, it should be more of a greenish tone. Let's see. Doesn't look to be... you know what? I skipped a step. There we go. See, it's very easy to forget little steps here. So we have to go in here and we have to fill this mask. So let's go ahead and fill that. And there we go. Now we've actually got the change in color that we wanted. There we are. So if I go this way, you can see it's kind of magenta-y, which we probably don't want. I don't really like that particular color. So we'll do something like that where it's just a little bit more greenish. Maybe increase the saturation a tiny bit, something like that. And then for lightness, we can maybe darken this sky down a little bit as well. Something along those lines. All right, so that is all we're going to do with the sky. And again, just to make sure when you're doing those kinds of things, don't get tripped up by the fact that you have to fill those masks sometime. Anytime you don't see it happening, you don't see the effect, just make sure that you've actually got the mask filled in. Now, one thing that I would like to do as well, and this is sort of the reason why I did this as its own local adjustment, is you can kind of see on the bottom here, if we toggle this on and off, it creates a little bit of a kind of not so ideal transition between the ground and the sky here, just because there is that sort of feather in color that's happening. So what we can do is just grab a brush there as well, and it's actually going to hit E, which is going to give us our eraser brush because we want to take off the mask. And then right-clicking, we just want to lower the opacity of this maybe to something like 20%, and just kind of brush out this area a little bit so that it sort of transitions into that new color a little bit more smoothly. So if we look at our mask now, we can see that it's kind of removed from those transition areas, and why I removed it from there, I do not know. You can always paint that area back in. Let's just grab 100% flow rate here. There we go. All right, so that's just going to transition that a tiny bit better. So that's just giving us our sky. And then I think let's just add one more local adjustment layer while we're in this panel, and then we'll move on to other things. So we can just brighten the eyes a little bit as well. And then let's go ahead and take our flow rate down to something like 10%. Certainly we'll want a much smaller brush for that. And I tend to enable the mask for this just so I can see kind of what areas I'm painting in.
Someone pulled you up on your camera shake earlier, Michael, just to warn you.
Yeah, I know, it's unfortunate. That's the problem with these high-resolution lenses you got here, David. It's I blame the model. It wasn't my unsteady hand, it was the model moving around.
She moved at the wrong time, yes.
She did. And this was actually at 1/1000th too, so yeah, I don't know. I don't know how that happened, but I take full responsibility. All right, so just brighten the eyes there a little bit, and you can kind of, play it by how much you need. Now, obviously, because I've gone up 0.4 here, it seems like a lot, but the mask wasn't 100% filled in, so that's realistically closer to like something 0.15, 0.2 in the exposure that I've actually increased, so it's not quite as dramatic. And if you find that anything is a little overdone, you can always scale it back by erasing. Like this eye, I could probably darken it down just a little bit, but we'll just let it slide this time around, and we can move on to some of the other adjustments here. So the next thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and adjust some of the levels here. This is actually one of my favorite tools inside of Capture One. I just find it really works nicely for the shadow and highlight end in particular. So what I tend to do is just sort of play around with these two ends until we really start to see things getting clipped on the histogram. So for this particular image, I might go something like 5 on the blacks, and then sometimes I actually accompany it with just a little bit of shadow recovery. It still kind of maintains a little bit of contrast but reduces some of the clipping. So even though we're kind of working against each other here, I find that the effect is different than if you just back this off. So you get some of the contrast, but again, you're not losing as much of the detail. And again, the beautiful thing is we're still in the raw file the whole time, so if we change our mind later, this information hasn't been flattened down and brought into Photoshop, we can always change our mind. And then on this end, I tend to kind of go pretty aggressively just to get the highlights popping really nicely. And if we just pull this down to somewhere in and around there, and we can kind of see on the histogram where things are starting to clip. Like if we pull this any more, now we're starting to lose information, so that's too much. And generally a good indicator is also kind of where you see the information here. So if you drag that into that point, that's kind of where we get a nice full spectrum in our histogram, and it gives us a nice amount of contrast. So that is one adjustment I tend to make quite often. And again, if you find that you're clipping a little bit, we can always scale this back a tiny bit on the HDR slider here. And another thing that's been kind of improved quite a bit lately in the most recent versions is the contrast slider. I find that that's working really nicely. Again, you don't want to go crazy on it because then it starts to not look so great. It looks okay in black and white if you have that much contrast, but in color you definitely don't want that. So I tend to just kind of go between like 1 and 5 on the contrast slider. anywhere in around that range, and just again check your histogram, make sure that nothing has been clipped. And then I do really like the natural clarity as well for images like this to help them pop a little bit. I tend to kind of push them anywhere from 1 to 5 for a portrait. It doesn't make things crunchy at all as long as you kind of stick to this natural method. And then let's go ahead and go into our curve here. And then again, we can do some color grading inside the curves itself. So just like you would inside of Photoshop, you've got your highlight end here, and you've got your shadow end on the other side. So we can kind of, tweak the tones that are in here. Maybe we want to just warm up some of the highlights a little bit, so we can just drag this down. And we're going to do some of this inside of the color balance tool as well. It's really whatever you're more comfortable with, but I'll show you both actually. And then if we want to kind of tweak the shadow end a little bit, in this case I don't think I'm going to. I actually prefer the way that color balance handles this, so we're going to leave that for color balance, and I'm actually going to scale this back a little bit as well. And then in the green, maybe we want to just, the actual shadows feel a little bit greenish to me, so maybe we want to make them just a little bit more magenta, so we can just pull this end in, and you can see we're adding magenta there. So just kind of a subtle change there. If you want, you can usually type in values. I'm not sure if you could do that on the ends. I know you can do it with these sort of points, but there we go. Let's just take it to there, and I think that's all I really want to do. I'm not going to mess around with the reds. And then here we can maybe add a little bit of a S-curve as well, just to add a tiny bit more contrast. So just some subtle points here.
Is the Luma curve your go-to one, Michael?
That's typically where I would use more of it. Like for grading, I'll use these ones, but for contrast, usually Luma curve is where I'll kind of tweak it just a little bit. I don't tend to use it if I'm preparing for Photoshop. For Photoshop, really, I just use levels and a little bit of contrast slider, and then I make that final adjustment. The workflow is a little bit different right now because we're assuming this is our final image. If I'm going to Photoshop, I want a file that's slightly flatter. I don't want quite as much of that contrast built in advance because I want to maybe build it up a little bit inside of Photoshop. I don't really want to commit to that much contrast. So I would probably have scaled some of this stuff back if I knew I was taking it in. But again, we'd have the freedom to change our mind later if we need to. So right now, I'm kind of assuming this is our final image.
So yeah, and sorry, Michael, to interrupt you. And just in case anyone wonders what the heck is a Luma curve, the Luma curve is basically luminosity. So you can make changes to that curve, and your colors will be stable, basically. So it's great with this kind of image, I assume, Michael, as you don't mess around with the color work you've done and your skin tone and so on and so forth.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And it allows you to make, slightly more controlled changes than you would with maybe something like a contrast slider, because you can really dictate where those points are.
Absolutely.
So how heavily we want on the shadow end or highlight end. So yeah, it's a nice tool to have, along with the levels, which I find kind of works a little bit differently rather than just kind of dragging these end points on the Luma curve. I find that the shadow and highlight ends here just do a really nice job of preserving the color, but giving you a little bit more of that broader histogram and really increasing the contrast in a nice, smooth way. So in the Colors tab, we're going to go into Color Balance, and we're going to tweak a few things here. So I tend to start with the shadow end, and basically the way this color balance works is we can sort of decide what color we want to increase on the shadow end. So I'm going to maybe pick something like this. Again, I kind of feel like it's still a little bit greenish, a little bit yellowish, so we can find something that straddles in the middle of that to offset it, because obviously if we want to offset yellow, we're going to add blue, and if we want to offset green, we're going to add magenta. So we're going to add sort of a little bit of both by finding a point somewhere in around here. You can also do this by sliding things along the center point, which I don't really like to do because it's not as controlled. I like to just kind of set the color and then increase that effect here. And then you can also control sort of the the brightness and darkness of that there as well with that slider. I tend not to use that one too much. I really just usually stick to the color. So just move it up to the point where you feel things are looking good. Obviously every image is different. And then on the highlight end, we're going to do the same thing, but we're just going to grab some different colors. I tend to leave the mid-tone to the end because then I kind of know globally what I want to maybe offset. So I usually stick to sort of the edges first, and then I finish off with the mid-tone, which is much more global in nature. So with this one, with the highlights, maybe I want to add, again, a little bit of warmth. So we'll pick something around here to offset some of the magenta that we added. We can just kind of increase that a little bit. And then you can certainly, you know, slide this around and see where it looks good. I mean, one thing you can do is just push it to the extreme and then just kind of move around and see which color is complementing things nicely, and then scale back. That's oftentimes how I'll do it. So I found that this color here was okay, but obviously in moderation. So we're going to just reduce this down. Yeah. Okay, so something like that maybe is pretty good. And then in the midtones here, we're going to just maybe overall, again, I feel that it's perhaps a tiny bit on the green side. We could do that using the tint slider, or we can do it in here. So we can just maybe pull this towards magenta a little bit and kind of give our image overall a little bit of magenta. And so if we hold down the Option or Alt key and we roll this back, you can see the effect is fairly subtle, but it just makes the colors a little bit more pleasing. It takes out some of that you know, yellowish, greenish sort of haze that we have to the image. And then what we're going to do as well is work on the skin tone slightly, just to kind of bring that to something that is a little more pleasing. So we're going to grab, in the color editor, we're going to go to the skin tone tab and just grab the sampler here and just pick something that's sort of a middle of the road skin tone that you like. This is kind of a good area for me because some of these areas we see it's just got a bit of a suntan, so they're a little too saturated. We can certainly scale that back with a local adjustment. We can brush that in and maybe desaturate a little bit, or using the color editor locally, we can also grab that red and just take down saturation. There's a lot of different ways to deal with that. But in this case, we're just going to kind of globally adjust things here. So we've got our skin tone selected, and we can actually play with sort of this distribution of hue and saturation. So we're going to just shift the hue, I think, a little bit more. Let's see which way we want to take this. Let me just make sure that I'm actually, let me do one thing here. Make sure that I am not, yeah. With the skin tone editor, David, I find that sometimes it gets, you know, unlike the color balance, it gets a little wonky when you have a different local adjustment layer selected. I don't know if that's just something I'm not doing right or what, but you have to make sure you have the background layer selected, otherwise things get a little,
It should in default, if you were even on a different, because you're in the local adjustments tool tab, if you had
so just make sure that you select background before you dive into there.
Yeah, exactly. Or come out of the local adjustments tool tab. And then, because I see on your color editor, if you look next to your color editor, you've got the little paintbrush. So that means you're always going to be editing the selected layer.
Gotcha.
So that's why. So that's an option which is turned on in the sub menu of the color editor. So your color editor is set to edit whatever layer is selected. If that's not on, it will edit the background layer unless you're in the local adjustments tool tab.
Right.
It sounds horribly complicated, but basically what it means is that when you're in the local adjustments tool tab, your tools will work on the currently selected layer. If you're not in the local adjustments tool tab, they will work on the background layer. So. And
if all else fails, just make sure when you go into here, you're working on the background layer.
That works too. Yeah.
So we're just going to shift this hue a little bit more towards magenta. As you can see here, if we go this way, it gives us kind of a green skin tone, which never is really very flattering. So we're just going to kind of knock it down a tiny bit, something like that. And then we're going to just desaturate the skin a little bit too, because I just find it a little bit too saturated. And with the lightness, I tend not to really move that around too much, but we can just increase it a little bit. And then for the uniformity, for something like this, you don't want to go crazy with it, because what it'll do is just kind of flatten things out, because we have a lot of different things that are yellow. Her lip is a slightly different shade, and we've got the ground that is kind of similar to the skin tone. So we're just going to nudge it slightly just to give us a little bit more of a uniform feel, but we're not going to go crazy on it because we don't want it to sort of flatten out our colors. So I might even just scale back on that. So that's kind of what we're going to do with skin tone. Now, one thing I want to do is, because we've added some of this contrast here, we sort of clipped a little bit of the details in the shirt. So we're going to bring that back slightly. We're just going to go into here and we're going to create a new layer called shirt. And we're just going to hit B for brush and M for mask. And then what I'm going to do here is I want to make sure that my my flow rate is 100%. And then for opacity, we can do something like 50%. So we can always build up more if we need to. And one thing that works well in this case is this auto mask, which will kind of help to keep our mask in line with the shirt itself, particularly on this edge here, because there's a nice sort of sharp contrast between the color of the shirt and the background. So what we really want to do is just kind of roughly mask this in. And even though I'm kind of going outside the edge, it will sort of fix that. So it took care of that a little bit there. We can always erase it down if we want. Best thing is to not go over by too much, because then it doesn't quite work as well. And this doesn't have to be perfect by any means. We just want to kind of recover some of the details. And then we can just go over this area here. And then I should be able to just say fill mask, and that will just fill in the remaining areas for me. And then we can turn off the mask and just kind of recover some of this highlight detail here. And if we want to, we can just turn down the exposure ever so slightly. So that's just going to bring back some of that detail in the shirt that we may have lost with our adjustment. And then the last thing we're going to do, just to kind of finish things off, is we can just add a little vignette. So if you increase vignette, we're going to obviously lighten that area. And then if you go negative, we can just sort of darken it a bit. So we'll do that. And that is pretty much it. Let me just go down to saturation here and just globally desaturate this whole image a little bit. Yeah, something like that. So we've gone through a lot of different features within Capture One just to get to this point. So hopefully there's some questions that we can answer.
Yes,
all right.
There is. Do you want to? Could you throw up a just do a new variant of the image in its unadjusted state?
Let's see. You know what? I just want to make sure that let's do a new variant, and then what I'll do is I'll just copy. Actually, you know what? Hang on, because it's gonna grabbing my filter. So let me just.
Oh yeah, clone and reset.
Let me just clone it. Yeah. Where's the clone variant? And then we'll just undo a bunch of this stuff here.
Yeah.
It takes a second to do this copy now, because we've had the masks that need to be copied over. So if you're wondering why it takes a minute, it's just those masks that do
gazillion layers
require a bit. So let's just scale all of this stuff back here, and our local adjustments, which take again a minute to roll back.
So what was your laptop again? A 2013 MacBook Pro?
2013, yeah.
2013, yeah.
I think we're all annoyed about the changes that have happened with the MacBook Pro, so that's why I haven't updated yet, but I really am due.
Yep.
So, I mean...
Well, from a new MacBook Pro, mine's been pretty good, so...
Has it been pretty good? Yeah, well, that's good to hear.
Been working very well, so...
All right, good. For me, it's just I'm waiting on that RAM. Once they have that, then I'll upgrade. Okay, so there's our sort of where we started and where we ended up. Yeah. So, I mean, the big thing really is just that extra bit of dimension and contrast that we've added, and kind of cleaning up some of the areas in this. So, I mean, without the chatter, you know, and obviously keeping in mind too that a lot of these things, like the color adjustments, if I had a series of these images, really the time where I would spend on each individual image is down to the dodging and burning, because obviously we can't copy that across unless you're doing like a product shot where things are in exactly the same spot. You're going to have to repeat that process separately, but all the color grading and all those adjustments that we made, that can just easily be copied over using copy and apply adjustments from one image to the next. So that first, you know, 15 to 20 minutes that we spent dodging and burning, a couple minutes figuring out how we want the actual color grading to look for this image, and then any subsequent images, it's really just that 15 to 20 minutes for the dodging and burning that we need to do, and then we can copy most of that stuff over, maybe making slight tweaks to the colors depending on, you know, time of day as we kind of move through the shoot.
For sure. Great. I do have a bunch of questions. I was
Okay.
beavering away in the background as well, answering other stuff. There was a couple of, and again, apologies to everyone if we don't get to your individual question. There was a couple of, or say 3 or 4 questions on a similar thread regarding Capture One versus Lightroom, and
Hmm.
not Lightroom, sorry, Capture One. We can discuss that if you want, but Capture One and Photoshop, because obviously you've gone a long way from what you started with on the right to where you got to on the left, of course, just using the tools in Capture One. My feeling is that you can pretty much get to the end result for editorial work in Capture One. If you're doing full-on beauty work, then that's when you're probably going to have to move into Photoshop as well for that extra fine detail retouching.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one thing that hopefully things are obviously improve as we go on. One thing is that cursor. If we had a little bit of a better indicator for the size, because that's kind of for
Yes.
dodging and burning that trips me up. So any improvements on that will make it that much easier. But that's really the only kind of thing that is a little more challenging with the dodging and burning. And obviously
Hmm.
because we're working on the raw file, we're processing so much more information. So having that update as efficiently as it does on a rasterized file, there's a challenge there. But obviously you're getting those benefits of the flexibility down the road as well. So you kind of have to take the good with the bad. So it's really just dependent on the type of image you have, what the purpose of that image is. But like I said, for a lot of portraits, basic editorial work, test shoots in particular, it's great where you don't have to store all that extra information on your hard drive. 25 megabytes certainly beats 300 to 500. And then you have the flexibility of that having that raw file there. You can change the color grading, you can change the cropping, all the original information is there. So yeah, you have to just kind of play around with it and see at what point you have to move into Photoshop. And if you've got a particular image where the model has terrible skin and you need to do a ton of retouching on it,
Sure.
then certainly, that's what Photoshop was built for. So take it in there. But you just really have to go case by case.
Yep. Regarding sort of the order of doing things, I mean, you did things in a relatively specific way. I mean, from a technical point of view, sort of engineering side, it doesn't matter what you do in Capture One when it's all non-destructive. But Ricardo was asking in particular, just to pull one example out, is it better to get the colors right before you dodge and burn, or dodge and burn is better as a first step to kind of give you that blank canvas to work on?
I tend to do the dodge and burn first because, as you saw, we did it in black and white, right? So, I mean,
Yep.
the color grading really has no bearing on the dodging and burning because dodging and burning affects luminosity. It doesn't affect color per se. I mean, when you go extreme on dodging and burning, you may notice saturation shifts, which,
Yeah.
again, that really only happens when you're doing very aggressive dodging and burning, which once again, if you're doing that, you probably should be in Photoshop, and there are ways to deal with that. And I do mention it in my course. So again, shameless plug. You can learn how to do that. But yeah, I mean, in this case, we see that it's not anything that would be noticeable because again, we kept that fairly subtle. So no, I mean, for me, I just do the dodging and burning because that gives me kind of that base image to work on. I could do it one way or the other, but again, for that response rate to be nice and quick, we want to kind of eliminate any sort of additional adjustments going on, be it the skin tone, the color balance. Let's give Capture One less work to do every time we paint in those masks. So that's why I tend to do it first.
Great.
After the dodging and burning, though, it really doesn't matter. I mean, you can kind of do it whichever
No,
way is
exactly.
comfortable for you. But I tend to find, exposure is a good thing to get right first and then finish off with colors.
Yeah, I always say exposure white balance because there's no point trying to work on an image
Exactly.
that's dud exposure and the wrong white
Yeah,
balance, but after that,
exactly.
really makes no difference. There's no mathematical order that anything is applied. It makes no difference to quality. So just go nuts. Everything is always reversible as such.
Exactly. Yeah.
Actually, Art just picked me up because I mentioned Lightroom, but that wasn't the question. But he said, many Lightroom users actually wonder whether to switch to Capture One, which is nice to hear. But did you have any experience with Lightroom, Michael? If you don't, then you don't have to answer. But
Yeah, I mean, for me, I can't really answer the question because it was so long ago that I switched
Sure.
over to Capture One. You kind of just don't look back anymore. And then obviously because I do shoot on the Phase One camera as well, there's that integration. But even before I was shooting on the Phase One, even with the Nikon, I made the switch at that point. So I don't really have any comments on that other than the fact that Capture One works great for me. So why would I even bother looking at Lightroom now? So
Yeah, exactly. Also, tethering as well is a good point
yeah,
as well. Shooting
that's a big
tethered,
thing
of
for sure.
course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just scanning down the questions. I'm a big fan of yours.
Thank
Who's
you.
that? Homar said, I've bought your D&B, color grading, retouching tutorials, RGG, and so on. Can you suggest a good medium format entry level camera? You're using what, the IQ 250 now, is that right?
I got the 250, yeah. So I mean,
Yeah.
when it comes to medium format, there's really no entry level per se. There's the older models that you can look at getting
True.
used, and that was kind of where I started. I actually, well, my original one was not used, but I think it was like a demo or something along those lines. You can get really good deals if it's used or a demo model or something along those lines. So definitely look at that because, I mean, the cameras last forever. So especially with the backs, they're effectively indestructible. Even if it has, 200,000 exposures on it, it really makes no difference. So take a look at that is my best recommendation because you can save a ton of money getting them used.
Yeah. Definitely. Yep. Always worth asking the partners for you stuff for sure. Art-based question, I guess, or subjective question from Carlos. Is there a technical way to capture the right skin tone? Very good question. No such thing as the right skin tone.
Yeah, that's just it. It kind of depends on the look, right? You may have a set of images that have a particular color cast, which, that skin tone in isolation would not work very well in most cases, but coupled with the rest of the color cast in the image, the background, whatever it might be, it works. So there's no right skin tone. It all kind of depends on the situation. Let's say if I was shooting this half an hour later when the sun was even lower, then the skin tone would be much more orange, but the surrounding area would kind of help to offset that. And even though the orange wouldn't look good right now under this sort of background and lighting condition, it looks good there. So, it really depends on the light quality, what kind of overall mood you want out of your images, or there's an editorial maybe that has a particular mood throughout. So no, there's really no way. I mean, when it comes to skin tones, it's really just kind of practicing and seeing what's pleasing to the eye and ultimately what's pleasing to your eye, because it's a very subjective and personal thing. So to some people, they may not like that skin tone. Some people may love it. So it kind of can become your sort of signature look to have a particular skin tone as well.
What time was this shot taken? Sarah was just asking.
This was like maybe an hour before sunset in and around. So I mean, it was at the time sunset here was 6:30. This was probably actually no, sorry, it was earlier than that. It was like 5:45. So this was probably like 4:45. And sunset was 5:45.
Very nice, very nice. Sorry, I'm just going down the big list of questions. This webinar is amazingly helpful. Thanks, Kate. That's great. You can always watch it again. Oh, Stefan was asking. That was it. I don't quite know how to answer this in an intelligent way, so you can have a go. Why don't you use the uniformity sliders in the skin tone tool to do what dodging and burning does?
Well, because uniformity won't really, like uniformity, for example, there's a separate luminosity there, but it's not that simple. Like there's no way that uniformity can solve the problems of dodging and burning, because dodging and burning is by nature about selectively affecting areas. So, uniformity would blindly kind of try and blend things together so that they look similar, but what we don't really want everything to look similar. What we want is just certain areas of the skin to transition better. So there's really no shortcut. I mean, if that worked so perfectly, then well, certainly Capture One would be used by every single person on the planet, because if I could save all the dodging and burning time, that would be amazing. But dodging and burning is really just kind of a skill that you have to learn, and it's not something that computers at this time can really do for us, because it's almost like an artificial intelligence kind of thing that we'd have to really tackle. It's not as simple as just evening out all of the luminosity. It's just selective areas. So yeah, it can't really.
That's a good answer. Like I think the uniformity slider does a great job. Like if you're doing a headshot and you just wanted, corporate headshot, and you wanted to clean up skin tones in a relatively simple way, or use it as a precursor to dodging and burning, but you won't get that manual precision that you did with the image here compared to what you can do with uniformity.
And particularly, like, one of the things too is that when we have more sort of editorial makeup or something where let's just Sorry, let's just zoom that back out. Where we have some of these like stronger highlights and everything, in this area. One thing we don't want to do is wipe that out, right? We do want to keep certain areas where the luminosity isn't a match. So like I said, it's very selective. There's areas where we do want to keep it, and there's areas where we notice that their skin actually has a shift in pigment or something like that, and that's what we want to fix.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I definitely urge people to check out uniformity because it can be a good quick fix. But yeah, nowhere near as precise as what you did today.
The old-fashioned way. Yeah.
The old-fashioned way. Yeah. Do you often use, Art was asking, dodge and burning to correct skin imperfections rather than cloning as such?
Yeah, I mean, like you saw that little thing on the nose there where, it's kind of like from a sunburn or whatever. That could normally be removed just using something like a healing brush or whatever. In this case, I just sort of dodged it out. So it depends on the circumstance. There are some cases where, if the texture is really messed up, you're not going to dodge forever to try and fix a textural problem. Then it's better to clone it out. But if it's really more of just a luminosity shift where it doesn't quite match up like it was in the case on the nose there, then it's just as easy for me to do it using, dodging it out. So yeah, just really think about whether it's a textural problem or it's just a luminosity problem.
And I believe, as you said earlier, if the model had super bad skin or whatever, then that's definitely a multiple healing job for Photoshop as such.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're going to spend 15-20 minutes of healing, then it's better to do that in Photoshop.
Yeah, exactly. We have the spot tool, which gets rid of minor blemishes and that sort of stuff. But if you need to do extensive skin work, then Photoshop is your friend then as such.
That's right.
Yeah.
Want to do one more to wrap up?
Yeah, because we're pretty much on our hour. So last question. I used Lightroom for 4 years, moved to Capture One, never went back. That's great. Thanks for that, Craig. Get that plug in. It's great to see what subtle changes make, Carl was saying. I'm just reading out some of the good stuff. Last one, here we go. Russell said, do you ever use the film grain tool in Capture One? Would you use it after or before going to Photoshop?
Yeah, I do actually. Like for an image like this is the kind of case where I would use it. I always, if I'm in Photoshop, I tend to, well, you can do it one of two ways. Like if I'm working with Photoshop, then I will either save it as a TIFF and then export out of Capture One and then add the film grain there. Or if I'm working purely out of Photoshop, then I'll add film grain in there using something like, I think it was Alien Skin Exposure. But in this particular case where I'm working purely in here, at the end when I do the export, I always like to add a little bit of film grain. And that is really, it's always best to do it at the very end of the process because film grain kind of, I find, depends on the size that you're outputting. So if I'm going to output this at 3600 px on the long edge versus the original, which is like 8000, I want that film grain to kind of look right for that particular resolution. So I always do it at the very end. So if you want to use it in combination with Photoshop, then save your Photoshop file as a TIFF and then export out of here and add the film grain. Or if you've got a plugin for Photoshop, you can use film grain there. But don't ever add the film grain ahead of time before rasterizing, because then you've kind of reduced the quality of the image.
Absolutely.
In a sense. And you really do want to adjust it for your output size and media, like on paper versus screen, you may want to apply it differently. And then you guys have added some nice proofing tools for that as well. So I'm sure you probably have a video on some of the proofing tools.
Yep, there's a video on proofing, so you can proof your output size in Capture One, which will scale down the image and show you what the sharpening will look like, the color profile, the size, and JPEG compression as well. So you could play around with the grain tool whilst you were proofing to get the exact look you want, because it is going to look different from 100% down to 1000 pixels across or whatever your example was. Yeah, great. Okay. Well, I'm sorry to everyone if we didn't get to your exact question. Those of you, quite a lot of you are asking about other resources. So if you look roughly in an hour's time, you'll get links how you can follow Michael, so his Facebook page, web page, and so on. So look out for that follow-up email. There's also a link to the Capture One Pro YouTube channel, which has all our video resources on there as well. So that's a good place to start if you want to kind of get started with Capture One and so on and so forth. I'm just going to steal the screen back from you for a second.
Sounds good, Dave.
Michael,
Yeah,
if you...
definitely check out those resources because this was not meant to be sort of a getting started guide with Capture
No,
One. We sort of
exactly.
launched into all of those features. So if you want to
Yeah.
dig into those more, there's kind of specific videos for each of those different tools that we looked at today.
That's right. So that was local adjustment, color grading, color edits, exposure corrections, and everything all kind of
Exactly.
in one go. So that's pretty impressive. Okay, I'm just going to let people know that next week, if you want to come back, if we haven't put you off. Oh, excuse me. Let's get Keynote back again. 23rd of March is the next one. I've got another guest. It's guest month at the moment. We've got landscape photography with Drew. He's a colleague of mine, so he's going to talk about some of his techniques for landscape stuff. And actually, the week after that, another guest, we've got a friend of yours, Michael, I believe, Pratik Naik, who's a retoucher as color expert as well. So to give his examples on how he uses Capture One, and also with his partner Bella, who's a photographer as well. So that's going to be an equally fun-packed hour.
I'll have to catch that one myself.
Yeah, catch that one yourself. You never know. Yeah,
Steal some ideas from me.
exactly. And as I said, we did record this, so you can always catch it again on tomorrow. I'll probably upload it tomorrow morning sometime, so you can watch it once more. So thanks, Michael, for spending an hour of your precious time with us today. It's been great. Lots of nice compliments.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, anytime. So hope to see you again soon. Cheers, Michael.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.